Hi, I'm Old Norse Specialist Jackson Crawford. In 2019, when I still kind of thought that the book was going to be out sooner, I began doing a series of videos chronicling the life of the great Norse hero Bodvar Bjarki from the saga of Rolf Kraki and his champions, Old Norse Rolf Saga Kraka og Kapahans, which is included in my newest book of translations from Hackett Publishing Company, two sagas of mythical heroes, Hervor and Heithrek, and Rolf Kraki and his champions. And now, 2 years later, as that book actually nears completion, or nears publication, it is complete, I finally actually know what that book will look like for one of these videos. So there you go. And in fact, the bear on the cover is in nod to Bodvar Bjarki and his father, as they are very bear-like. And in fact, Bodvar Bjarki's dad, if you recall, is a bear. And in the very last part of the saga in which Bodvar Bjarki appears, he also manifests as a bear. The exact mechanism of that is a little bit unclear. It does seem like his hugur, the Norse word for thought, mind, kind of spirit, although I don't love that word for it. It kind of suggests something that might be there after death somewhere else. It seems like that leaves his normal human body and possesses a bear, which seems different from his dad's, or manifests as a bear, which seems different from his dad, Bjorn, who actually seemed to physically completely change from a bear to a person with equivalent parts turning into, ursine or human parts as applicable, because for instance we see that a ring that he puts under his armpit as a man is under the same armpit as a bear. So there's something different going on in the way these transformations are conceived of, but still it's interesting that he shows up as a bear too. And of course, we saw previously that Bodvar Bjarki's story has a lot of parallels with Beowulf's story, and Beowulf also is a bear-like hero. In fact, his name in Old English, Beowulf might mean bear. For a lot more about these bear-themed heroes, look for the work of Peter Jorgensen on the Bear's Son folktale, a very old folktale type of which the Bodvar Bjarki story and the Beowulf story are both instantiations. Well, let's finish up the Bodvar Bjarki story now that I can actually show you what the cover looks like, and now that I'm standing very much in the territory of a known grizzly bear. Not that I think he'll show up for us, but, it's, I guess, neat to sort of honor the bear theme that way. Alright, so for a long time after Hrolf's expedition to Sweden, which we chronicled in the last video in this series, Hrolf and his champions sit in peace in Denmark. Things are going okay, and Hrolf has many subordinate kings who pay him taxes. Among them is a certain sub-king named Hjorvarðr, who is married to Hrolf's sister Skuld. Now, many other generations of Rolf Kraki's family are covered in his saga that we're not covering in this video series. It's focused on Bodvar Bjarki. But we know from previous chapters in the saga of Rolf Kraki that Skuld is the daughter of Rolf's father Helgi and an elf woman, Ulfkona, and that Skuld is a witch, which comes up. Now, Skuld and Hjorvarðr chafe under the thumb of her brother Hrolfr, and they want to resist him and take their rightful places as true sovereigns. So they scheme about how to do this, and they decide that what they will do is send messengers to Hrolfr and ask that they be allowed not to pay their taxes for 3 years at a time, but then to pay all the taxes owed for those 3 years in one big lump sum at the end of the 3 years. try that with the IRS and see if they'll go for it. But Hrolver does go for it. I guess you could argue Vikings are less ferocious than the IRS. And now Skuld and Hjorvarder have the time and the money to build up their army to fight Hrolver and his champions. Well, at the end of these 3 years, sure enough, Skuld and Hjorvarder show up with an army of the worst kind of men, as well as, quote, elves and Norns, which she has raised by her Seither, or unsavory magic. Now, of course, we know the Norns as the 3 female beings who determine fate, Urður, Verdandi, and Skuld, and that's not who can be meant here. In Fafnismál and the parts of the Saga of the Volsungs based on the matter in Fafnismál, we hear that there are many individual Norns, that each person has individual Norns, and Snorri also picks up that tradition too. So it may be that Norn is a broader term than just the 3 big goddess-like figures who determine fate. Or maybe, given that the saga is written at a pretty late point, Norn is being used here as kind of a more general term for supernatural female figure, right? It is a little bit suspicious that elf is being used in such a negative connotation here. Usually in Old Norse, elf is a more positive term. So maybe what we really ought to be picturing here is just like kind of generically bad supernatural men, bad supernatural women, or witches, something like that. At any rate, it's an interesting choice of terms. The Saga of Hrolkraki is actually written in pretty late Old Norse, or even early modern Icelandic, so the vocabulary is often not exactly what we'd expect from the more classical Old Norse language, if you will, of something like the Prose Edda, or in fact the Saga of Hervor and Heidrek, which is in the same volume. Alright, so this army bears down on Hrolver in his capital just as he and his heroes are getting drunk at their Yule feast. Of course, Yule being the holiday around the winter solstice, roughly similar to Christmas, although with many different characteristics. Now the saga turns to Hjalti, right, the former wimpy kid, now champion, and pointedly calls him Hjalti in Hugprudi here, Hjalti the righteous. Hjalti, at the moment that Skuld and Hjorvarder show up with their army, is in bed with his concubine, paramour, and he suddenly shoots up from bed and he asks her a strange non sequitur question. He says, "What do you think is better, 2 22-year-old men or 1 80-year-old man?" Her response, "I think 2 22-year-olds would be better than any 80-year-old man," infuriates him, and he says, "You whore, you'll pay for these words," and he bites her nose off. At this point he says, "Let me know if any men start fighting over you now, but I expect few of them will think you are much of a treasure from here on out." She says, "You've done evil to me that I didn't deserve," and he responds, "Ekki verður við öllu sett," which I translate, "I can't be responsible for everything." This is a strange scene, a disturbing scene for our sensibilities today. You know, he's taking out some kind of, dread or something on this woman. Presumably the question about the 2 22-year-olds or the 1 80-year-old is supposed to kind of test like her potential marital fidelity if she were to be married to 1 80-year-old man. But obviously his violent outburst belies the very prominent description of him as Hjalti the righteous right here, and certainly disturbs our modern sensibilities. But the story is there, and that's why I tell you it's there. Now Hjalti is going to go to the feasting hall and suddenly launch into a speech encouraging all of the champions there to fight. And this is not the last speech of this late part of the saga. There's quite a bit of speechifying. King Hrolver, in turn, launches into his own speech about how they're going to show their enemies, and the way they're going to show them is by getting happily drunk before the battle is joined. Note, I do not recommend that you get drunk before fighting for your life, but in the tropes of Norse sagas, it makes sense. It's almost a way of showing that you're Drenga, right? You're going to You're going to be happy and drunk when you go and fight your last fight. Well, they go out into the fight. There's a hard battle. All of the 12 champions are there except for Bodvar Bjarki fighting next to their king. Where is Bodvar? Well, let's come back and look at that question just a moment after I give you a quick word, as usual, from my sponsor. So I said that all the champions, and of course there's 12 champions, are there except for Bodvar Bjarki fighting next to King Rolver. But in Bodvar's place, there is a huge bear, and the bear is doing an awesome job defending the king. He's knocking down the king's enemies left and right, and grinding them down with his teeth. Now, knowing that Bodvar's father was a bear, and given the general supernatural nature of these stories, we might expect the characters to give credence to the thought that perhaps the bear is Bodvar. But Hjalti just sits there fussy about the notion that Bodvar isn't fighting with them, so he runs back to the hall where he finds Bodvar seemingly sitting and doing nothing. Of course, it seems like his hugr, right, his mind is out of him, it's in this bear. Well, Hjalti starts to scold him. He says he'll burn this hall down if Bodvar won't stop being such a cowardly shirker and come fight with them. Bodvar replies with his own long speech, cites many precedents from previous battles about how he's not afraid to fight. And he says that because Hjalti disturbed him, he is actually seeing to it that Bodvar is giving the king less help than he'd otherwise be, without ever explaining that he's the bear, right? Like, I guess he thinks that it would be so difficult to explain that it's just not worth explaining, or, we're just supposed to understand this as the people the story is being narrated to, and the characters within it don't understand. Well, they return to the fight, finally, although it goes worse and worse now. Skuld throws more magic at them, including a magic boar that comes and fights them, and it's a very fearsome opponent. And she begins to raise her dead troops to fight again. So now the champions are surrounded by living and undead troops. They're being overwhelmed, and what should they do but start launching into speeches? I've mentioned before, here, there, and yonder, probably in this series of videos, that Hrolf Kraki is really, it's an action fantasy, right? But it's sort of many different action fantasies, and it sometimes seems like it's roughly 5 series of a TV show that kind of roughly go together, but that were written by 5 different people. Because the big speechifying isn't really characteristic of earlier parts of the saga, but it's way characteristic of these last parts. So Bodvar launches into a long speech. This time, unaccountably, he starts talking about a great duel that he fought against King Abils of Sweden. I remember him from previous installment, which is not told of elsewhere. So, at some point he had this great fight. And he also briefly rants against Odin, calling him, quote, in my translation, that foul and treacherous son of evil, off quote, before they are all killed. And of course the narrator takes a moment to pity King Hrolver and his men, because their one flaw, it's not biting women's noses off for answering riddling questions wrong, it's that they didn't believe in Christ, which might have helped them survive. Of course, it's still interesting that Bodvar is living up to the ideal of the so-called godless hero by rejecting the Norse gods. Godless hero is a big trope in the sagas. It's someone who couldn't realistically, because of the timeline, be expected to be a Christian, but who rejects the Norse polytheistic gods. He's not not what TV tropes calls a flat earth atheist. He is someone who believes there's some higher power, but thinks that it's not these gods, right? He's someone who would be a Christian if he had the chance to be. One neat little detail to mention before I totally wrap this up is the exchange between Bodvar and Hjalti is given in a lot more detail in an unexpected source, which is the history of the Danes, the Gesta Danorum, by Saxo Grammaticus, a rough contemporary of Snorri. who also recorded some alternative versions of other myths, most notably the story of the death of Balder in a very different form, which I've talked about in another video. Saxo recounts much more of the dialogue between Bodvar Bjarki and Hjalti, and of course he's writing in Latin, so he gives them the very Latinized names Bjarko and Hjalto. He probably is basing this dialogue on a lost Old Norse poetic original, and that is putatively reconstructed as something called Bjarkamal, right? Words of Bjarki, an Eddic-style poem. Bodvar Bjarki. We do not actually have the original form of this poem in Old Norse, but it did presumably exist and form the basis of Saxo's dialogue between Bodvar Bjarki, Bjarko, and Hjalti, Hjalto. Well, in the course of getting killed by Skuld's living and undead troops, Hjorvarður, Skuld's husband and king, is killed too, so it is Skuld who will take over after her brother, who she betrayed. But she doesn't rule long. You might recall that before Bodvar Bjarki had left Norway, he had met up with his brother Moose Frothy, the half-moose brother, who had pledged that he would avenge Bodvar Bjarki. And so he does, aided by their brother Thorir Dogfoot, and with an army sent by Rolver's mom, Yrsa, in Sweden. And by the way, with Volger, the servant who'd sworn he would avenge Rolver in Sweden, they come and they depose and kill Skuld. And with that, the story of Bodvar Bjarki, as well as the saga of Rolf Kraki and his champions, comes to a close. So it's a strange saga, just full of strange events that, like I said, don't always seem to go together in a very direct way. That's obviously not me trying to discourage you from reading it. I actually do encourage you to read it. Just keep in mind that it's episodic, right? It's like, oh gosh, I hate saying this, but it's like The Empire Strikes Back or The Two Towers, in the sense that it almost seems like a middle episode of something where we're catching up with lots of different characters doing different things, and maybe different people kind of worked on the different parts of the story, and so they don't quite mesh up in the way you'd expect. But that's just very typical saga storytelling. I do hope you'll check out Two Sagas of Mythical Heroes, Hervor and Heidrek and Rolf Kraki and his champions. The official release is October 19th, 2021. For now, from beautiful Wyoming, high up in bear country, I'm wishing you all the best.